So as we stand at a juncture where we can say that the uncertainties that were inherent to globalization are giving way to uncertainties about globalization and the global economy's future itself. I'm going to be discussing briefly the Indian experience of development in this over the last 3 decades or so of India's insertion into the process of globalization. And it's a kind of, you can say, a variant of a story that we have heard several times before in this conference and, of course, earlier. So the way I look at it, globalization was a process in which, to the capitalisms of the third world, it was a process in which there was a peculiar kind of, or a distinct kind of intertwining of capital's exploitation of labor and what one might call imperialist exploitation, which involved the first taking place through some kind of a relocation of production to, or changing geography of production towards cheaper labor locations in the third world. And Indian capitalism was one of the ones which sought to secure its own advance by inserting itself into that process, leveraging on its own cheap labor context. But this process, which led to kind of emergence in the case of at least some economies, including India is included in that list, did not necessarily translate into development in the sense in which we understand it, because of course the cheap labor context went with increasing inequality, and very few countries have managed to graduate through that process of expansion beyond that. And India certainly has not been one which has been able to graduate out of that cheap labor context. In fact, in many ways, its dependence on that has increased over time. So looked at from the point of view of India's capitalists, of course, this insertion into the globalization process was extremely successful. And this particular graph captures how dramatic that process was. I'm using a particular indicator because this Indian corporate sector data is not comparable across time always. But this is one which is available, which is an indication of how rapid has been the increase in the share of profits, corporate profits in India's national income. So for 40 years after independence, the retained earnings of corporate India never crossed 2% of GDP. But now they are in the range of 10 to 12% of GDP. That's how dramatic the rise has been, built on a combination of an increase in the share of the corporate sector within the range of economic activities in India, as well as a redistribution in favor of profits within the corporate sector. Is that particular combination, and the most dramatic period of that rise, if you will see here, is the period of the big boom before the 2008 global crisis. That's when the biggest shift actually takes place. So from the point of view of corporate India, this has been a very successful process of insertion into the global economy. But of course, the corporate sector represents a second layer of concentration over an already existing concentration in the ownership of wealth. It represents a bringing together of the wealth of many into a concentrated form. But within the corporate sector itself, of course, if you see that, you find that this large explosion of profits that has happened remains essentially within the control of a relatively small number of corporate groups in India. So in India, we have the business group structure. So several companies could be under the control of the same family. But even if you look at individual companies, formally over 800,000 companies are registered in India, but barely 353 of them account for 56% of the profits. And there are a few in the second round. So it's a highly concentrated process of expansion that has happened. The other side of that process, of course, is that if you look at personal ownership of wealth, that itself is highly concentrated in the top 10% of the Indian population. So the beneficiaries in terms of income of this process of expansion of the corporate sector have been concentrated in the top 10% of the Indian population. So you've seen this dramatic rise in inequality, where the top 10% accounts now for 56% of India's income, and almost everyone else, which is the 90%, has experienced a decline in its share. So the next 40, as well as the bottom 50%, have experienced significant decline in their shares. And of course, the top 10% controls all the wealth. So they have benefited from that. That means the rest of the 90% primarily are dependent on some kind of returns to laboring activity. They have faced a situation where actually even employment opportunities have been, this is Jessim had discussed yesterday, work participation in India has been falling. So from the point of view of the employed, now these figures are in rupees. It's not always easy to understand for an international audience what that means, but you could take it that the average Indian household, these are different categories of, from different sources, overlapping categories of people who basically rely on some kind of labor income. You could say that the average or 90% of Indian households' average income is what would buy the cheapest smartphone. Monthly income, the cheapest smartphone that you can think of in the market, that's about what a monthly income of a household or a salary of or a wage would be able to buy. That's the level of the earnings of almost 90% of India's population. There are very few people who have access to the so-called high salary incomes, which have also grown during this period. As you can see in this table, because this captures how high salary incomes, because while businessmen can evade taxes, salary earners in India cannot, because they're captured under the tax deduction at source system. So you can see how small is the proportion which has somewhat a high salary. To get a sense of where this is, all of us who are university professors are in the third row from the top. And our assistant professor colleagues would be maybe one row below. So we are ourselves located so high in the income ladder. Okay. So, but bulk of the people who rely on earning from employment earn very little, as the previous table showed. Okay. Now, how has this kind of story precisely unfolded? If you look at India's occupational structure, of course, it was even at the beginning of liberalization in the early 90s, dominated by agriculture. India was an economy where, if you think in terms of neoclassical production function, the L was in agriculture, the K was in industry, and the Y was in services. That was the kind of structure we had. And what you saw in the period after is the onset of an agrarian crisis, where agriculture was increasingly unable to sustain this large population that was dependent on it. And you have the beginning of an exodus from agriculture. It's a forced push out of agriculture that happened. You didn't have significant growth of manufacturing employment to absorb that. The only two sectors which have absorbed some of that exodus from agriculture is, of course, construction, which is the biggest, one of the most important ones, and services to a certain extent. But of course, you have to understand this in the background of what has happened to work participation. So it's not just that they moved to other sectors. Actually, a bulk of that push out of agriculture has gone nowhere in terms of actually paid work. Not that they are sitting idle, they're doing different kinds of unpaid work to sustain low-income households. So if you look at the output structure of the Indian economy, so bulk of this growth in this period has been based on services and construction, not on manufacturing. India had a very limited or stunted industrialization even before liberalization. And in this period, there's been no phase in which manufacturing has led India's growth process. And in the last decade or so, there is a clear sign of the onset of India is probably one of the most prominent cases of premature deindustrialization within the third world. Marked or sharp decline, because this is a long period graph, it's not so visible, but there is a distinct now, pretty long-term trend now of decline of manufacturing share in India's GDP. So, okay. Now, if to put this in some kind of a context, this is in the case of an economy where the industrialization level is still extremely low. If you look at India's manufacturing value added per capita, this is comparison with some advanced countries as well as some of India's emerging peers. And you can see India is one of the least industrialized economies. Of course, first has a large population, so in absolute terms, you often see a large industrial sector. Per capita terms, extremely low. And India is still one of the most agricultural in terms of its employment. And services, while it's a high share of GDP, India peculiarly is one in which the services share in employment is considerably below its share in GDP, which is the inverse of what it is in most typical cases. So it's not really transition to a service employment economy. It has not really come out of an agriculture dominated economy. It's some kind of lying somewhere in between. And this work participation ratios also in the Indian case, you can see, are significantly below most other countries, exception being South Africa, which is all, but South Africa at least records very high unemployment rates. In India, we don't seem to be showing very high unemployment rates to go with such low work participation. But of course, given the size of India's population, it appears to be a large economy in the world, but with a very significant difference in its share in the world economy when you look at it at current exchange rates, at market exchange rates, and when you look at it in PPP terms. And this difference is essentially boils down to the fact that it's an extremely cheap labor economy. That's what is the source of that difference. The non-tradables are therefore much cheaper in India than in other parts of the world. Okay. Now, in terms of its external sector account, okay, India has certainly not been a manufacturing export-led growth process in the last 3 decades. It's not seen that kind of a growth. What you see is, in fact, India's trade balance has worsened after liberalization, after the opening up of the economy, significantly. But the growth of IT services and large remittances from Indians working abroad, India, the largest recipient of remittances, have partially compensated for that. But the big difference that has happened is the way in which the current account balance has been, deficit has been financed. India has become much more reliant on capital flows from the rest of the world. But obviously, if you're not a major export destination for the world market, then of manufactured exports for the world market, it's quite clear what is the nature of capital flows you're dependent on. And between the expansion of the corporate sector, the emergence of a privileged middle class within the population, and the coercive operation of exposure to continuous exposure to volatile capital flows, neoliberalism has become deeply entrenched in the Indian economic context and in the way of functioning and thinking of the Indian state. It's in that background that one should look at what's happened in the context of the COVID crisis, a comparison with what was the picture of the crisis in 2008. So between 2008 and 2020, something changed, but some things didn't. So in 2008 crisis, the impact on output, of course, was much less than in the 2020 crisis. And it came in the back of a big boom in India's economy. The 2020 crisis came in the background of a slowing down of India's economy. Now, where it was already showing, the growth process already was showing signs of slowing down. And the adverse impact was larger. But keep in mind that these are official statistics. The reality is probably that the blue line should be a few levels below. This is a result of India's change to a new GDP series. The blue line should be actually a little bit below where it is. So what you have had since that, whatever recovery or the claim that India has been one of the fastest growing economies of the world is essentially a situation where we still haven't returned to the pre-COVID scenario. But despite this fact, if you look at what the state has been doing in terms of responding to the crisis, the 2008 fiscal stimulus that the Indian state imparted was itself criticized for being pretty small and much more heavily weighed in terms of tax cuts than on expenditure increases. But if you look at the present response, even before any recovery has happened, the process of cutting down on expenditures has already begun. And this reflects the different context, but also the continuation and the deeper entrenchment of the neoliberal approach. So the 2008 crisis came in the wake of that boom, increasing inequality, resulting in, for temporarily at least, an increase, the only period in which India's tax revenues improved. So you could combine reducing the fiscal deficit with some stepping out of expenditure. Post-global crisis, that stimulus continued for a period, but at the beginning of the decade, a story of fiscal consolidation began in trying to bring back the deficit down to the levels it had reached in 2008. The 2020 crisis comes in the background of actually the fiscal situation being, in neoliberal terms, far worse. Now, what has happened is that while this fiscal consolidation process was being attempted in the post-global crisis context over the last decade, since the beginning of the 2010s, what you've seen in India is a pretty dramatic change in the overall economic context, where you see clear signs of an extremely demand-constrained economy. Okay, so investment has collapsed. A dramatic rise in India's investment ratio in the pre-2008 period has been completely reversed in the last decade. India's exports have not grown. India's imports have also not grown because of the fact that import-using sectors have not been growing rapidly. Prominent amongst them is actually the manufacturing sector, where we have witnessed the second decade of industrial stagnation in India. So has the construction boom, which had begun in the mid-90s. Even that has completely collapsed. All this happened even before the COVID crisis struck. So what you've had is a situation where the government has been pursuing, or the state has been pursuing, a strategy of fiscal consolidation so savagely that even the 2020 pandemic did not evoke any kind of a significant response, and whatever little was there was reversed almost immediately. Okay. But this is in a background where the crisis has been deepening. Clearly the demand constraints created by this highly unequal process of growth, the inability to break out, to generate large exports and the combination of that with fiscal consolidation has meant that the demand in the Indian economy is being continuously squeezed. The accumulation process through expansion, as it has kind of faltered over this particular decade, Indian capital is increasingly shifting towards accumulation through encroachment and parasitism on the rest of the economy. And that's the process that one sees unfolding now, which has meant an increasing and closer collaboration between Indian capital and right-wing religious nationalism and authoritarianism, which we see as the feature of India today. Thank you.